The cold bit through Alexandra MacDonald's gloves before dawn had fully broken, and by the time she reached Cheapside the skin at her fingertips had gone from numb to burning, then to a thin metallic ache that matched the taste of hunger at the back of her tongue. A hat box too wide for her arms and tied with satin she would never be allowed to touch once it reached its destination, pressed into her wrists and made her shoulders shake each time she shifted it. Mud splashed up her skirt every time a carriage passed. Twice, wheels sent a fan of brown water across the hem of her grey wool. Once, a driver cursed at her for not moving quickly enough, though she had already flattened herself against a shuttered shop front to let him pass. Men in market aprons stepped around her as if she were a post set into the street. Women carrying baskets looked through her face, then through her body, and only at the box in her hands did their eyes sharpen with recognition that she belonged to someone richer than herself. The left shoe rubbed at the back of her heel where leather had split. By the corner near the fishmonger's she felt wet warmth in that shoe, and new skin had opened. She did not stop. Lady Harbury had said the favours must be delivered before 8. Lady Harbury had also said, with her hand on the breakfast-room bell and her smile fixed, that Alexandra would not be served food until she returned. A lesson in speed, she had called it. A lesson in usefulness. The street smelled of coal smoke and wet rope and oranges split on cobblestones. Her stomach tightened at the scent of hot bread from a bakery where girls with flour on their sleeves laughed while they loaded trays. She kept walking. The hat box grew heavier at each crossing, though she knew that was only fatigue. Inside were sugared almonds wrapped in silver paper and tied with pale ribbons, favours for the Harbury ball guests who would arrive in powdered wigs and jewelled slippers and take sweetness home in satin pouches while she stood by doors and carried cloaks. A small boy darted in front of her with a tray of newspapers. He clipped her elbow. The box tilted. She caught it against her chest before it fell, the edge striking the sore bone above her wrist, where yesterday Lady Harbury had gripped her hard enough to leave finger-shaped shadows. Pain flashed white and clean, then settled as a steady throb. No one noticed. A woman in blue silk, stepping down from a carriage, turned her head at the commotion and let her gaze travel once over Alexandra's damp skirt, patched glove, and unadorned bonnet. Contempt was quick, almost bored. Then she moved on. By the time Alexandra reached the milliner's side door and gave her name to a clerk who did not look up from his ledger, the bells were striking 8, and her legs trembled from cold and effort. The clerk took the box. He said, "You are late by 2 minutes." She opened her mouth to answer. She closed it again. His hand had already gone out, palm up, waiting for the receipt signature as if she were a footman. The walk back to Harbury House felt longer because there was no task to hold in front of her like a shield. Empty-handed, she was only the thin young woman in a mended cloak with dark hair coming loose under her bonnet pins. Rain began as a mist and turned sharp by the second square. Her collar soaked through. Water slid down her spine. By the time she reached the mews gate and went around to the servants' entrance, her feet had gone nearly senseless, except for the torn heel, which burned with every step. In the kitchen passage she paused when she heard cutlery on china in the breakfast-room, and the light, musical laughter of Arabella and Cressida Harbury. Her stepsisters never laughed in small sounds. Their mirth always carried. It was meant to. The cook, Mrs. Davies, passed the doorway with a tray of kedgeree and buttered toast and did not quite meet Alexandra's eyes. Sympathy in that house was always silent and therefore useless. Alexandra waited by the scullery sink until the tray returned, stripped clean. Then she entered the breakfast-room because she had been summoned, and Lady Harbury looked up from her coffee cup, as though surprised that a chair had spoken. You took an age, Lady Harbury said. Silk rustled as she crossed one ankle over the other. Lavender water reached Alexandra before the words did. I trust you did not disgrace us with excuses. No, ma'am. Arabella glanced toward Alexandra's hands. She is shaking. Is she ill? She is dramatic, Lady Harbury said. A common vice in girls with no prospects. You may have bread in the kitchen when the silver is counted, Alexandra. Not before. We cannot reward inefficiency. Alexandra inclined her head. She felt the room sway once and steady. Yes, Lady Harbury. Cressida smiled over the rim of her cup. Do not drip on the carpet. She turned and left before hunger could make her clumsy and before anger could make her foolish. In the passage she pressed her palm flat against cold panelling and counted 5 breaths, then 10. Her throat had tightened enough to hurt. She swallowed hard until it eased. Tears threatened and retreated. She had learned years ago that tears in Harbury House were treated like insolence, proof that punishment had not yet been sufficient. By the first week of November she had stopped letting them fall where anyone could see. Her attic room had one small window that looked across slate roofs and chimney smoke. Frost traced a fern pattern on the inside of the glass where the putty had cracked. She lit no fire. There was no coal allotted for her chamber except on nights of hard freeze, and Lady Harbury determined what counted as hard. Alexandra unlaced her left shoe and peeled off a stocking gone red at the heel, then wrapped the wound with a strip torn from an old handkerchief. The blood had not been much, but it had spread in a bright half-moon that would require scrubbing before the stain set. She moved to the mirror propped on her washstand, its silvering blackened at the corners, and pinned up the hair that had come loose in the rain. Dark hair, heavy and straight, pale face, too thin this season, eyes too large for fashionable prettiness, grey with a green ring that looked almost severe in poor light. Lady Harbury called her plain when guests were present, and troublesome when they were not. Alexandra knew the language of dismissal by heart. She also knew, because her father had told her while teaching her to read freight ledgers at this same narrow table, that a face did not determine worth, and that steadiness could be its own form of beauty. She held his old brass pen between finger and thumb for a moment, then set it back in the drawer beside the one relic Lady Harbury had not bothered to seize, a scrap of inventory paper in his hand, listing her mother's Highland garnet parure with a neat notation of crest marks and clasp repairs. She could recite the line without looking. Necklace, pair of drops, 2 bracelets, brooch with thistle setting. The chest that had held them remained locked in Lady Harbury's dressing room, for safe keeping, after the funeral. Always for safe keeping. The bell rang once for her attendance in the drawing-room, just as the church clock across the square marked 11. She changed into her less damp gown, though less damp still meant cold, and went downstairs with her shoulders straight and her chin level. Guests had already arrived to discuss seating for the grand ball. Lady Fenton in plum velvet sat near the fire with a lapdog and a fan of ivory sticks. Mrs. Quillen, whose husband lent money to half the square, occupied the sofa and watched everything with the serene interest of a woman who could afford to be amused. Arabella stood by the mantel in yellow silk, Cressida beside her in pearl grey. Both glittered at throat and ear. Alexandra carried in a tray of correspondence and stood where instructed, half a step behind Lady Harbury's chair, near enough to pass papers and far enough to be forgotten. "We must place the Duchess of Rexford near the musicians," Lady Harbury said, tapping her pencil against the card list. "She likes to be seen while she applauds." Lady Fenton laughed. "Who does not?" "Mrs.?" Quillen's gaze slid to Alexandra and paused on her bare throat. And this is your stepdaughter, I think. Miss MacDonald. She has your colouring nowhere, dear Lady Harbury. My husband's first wife's daughter, Lady Harbury said, with the careful emphasis she used for social correction. She is useful. She reads lists and remembers names, not an ornament, but one cannot have everything. The ladies smiled. Alexandra lowered her eyes to the tray so no one could read her face. Lady Fenton leaned forward. No jewellery today, Miss MacDonald? How severe! Lady Harbury answered before Alexandra could speak. She has none worth naming. A soft murmur of assent moved through the room like the stir of silk. Lady Harbury continued discussing floral arches, as though she had commented on weather. Alexandra felt heat rise under her skin in one swift wave, then leave her cold again. She stood very still. Her hands did not tremble. That was the only victory available to her in that room, and she took it. When the meeting ended and guests rose in a rustle of velvet and perfume, Lady Harbury handed Alexandra the seating cards without looking at her. You will carry these to the steward, then return to mend Arabella's overskirt. There is a split in the train. Try not to make it visible. Yes, Lady Harbury. As Alexandra turned, Mrs. Quillen touched her sleeve lightly, almost absent-mindedly. Child, are you unwell? You are very pale. Alexandra met her gaze and answered with perfect composure. I am quite well, ma'am. It was a lie. It was also the only kind of truth that kept a roof above her head. She crossed the threshold with the cards balanced in both hands, her stomach hollow, her heel wrapped in cloth already damp again, and the echo of Lady Harbury's sentence following her down the corridor like a bell that would not stop ringing. She reached the steward's room at the back of the house with the seating cards still level in her hands, though the muscles in her forearms had begun to tremble from holding herself rigid through the drawing-room scene. And Mr. Pell, bent over a side table crowded with sealing wax, list books, and lengths of ribbon for place cards, took the stack from her without greeting and began sorting rank from rank as if people were parcels. The Duchess of Rexford above the ambassador's wife, he muttered. The Earl of Denbigh beside no one argumentative. Lady Fenton where she can be admired and ignored at once. Alexandra stood by the door until he noticed she had not moved, because no instruction had been given to dismiss her, and only then did he flick his fingers toward a pile of folded napkins and say, These to the south gallery, then to Mrs. Finch for final alterations. She obeyed. She always obeyed first and considered later. In the south gallery, where afternoon light came thin through high windows and turned dust to pale gold, 2 footmen were carrying in extra candelabra while the butler argued over the placement of a musician's dais, and the whole house breathed that urgent, brittle rhythm that came before a grand event, a rhythm Alexandra had known since she was 16, and her father was still alive and had not yet sailed north to settle what he called a minor dispute in shipping accounts. Minor, he had said, laughing when she worried. 10 days, Alex, 2 weeks at the outside. He had touched the side of her face with an ink-stained thumb and promised to bring her paper from Edinburgh so fine her pen would glide like skates over ice. The ship did not return with him aboard. It returned with ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, 1 cracked signet, and 3 men who would not meet her eyes when they said there had been weather off the coast and confusion at the rail, and no certainty about the final hour. The body was never brought home. A memorial stone was placed instead, and before the mortar dried, Lady Harbury had asked for all household keys under the language of order, and every lock that had once answered to Alexandra's hand ceased to do so. She had been 18. Her morning dress had still smelled of soap and rain when Mr. Tolland, their solicitor then, arrived with debt schedules she had never seen, and letters bearing her father's name in a hand that looked almost right until one studied the pressure points, the blunt turn of the M in MacDonald, the over-careful loop in the D. She had studied. She had spoken. Lady Harbury had placed a cool palm over her wrist and told the room Alexandra was overtired by grief and had always imagined plots where none existed. The men had nodded. By the end of that month, the account books were moved to Lady Harbury's cabinet. The household allowance was reduced, and Alexandra's portion was listed under companion expenses, as if she were hired help who should feel gratitude for board. By the second winter after the funeral, even the old maid who had dressed Alexandra as a child had been dismissed for economy. And economy in Harbury House meant one thing only: silk for the favoured, scarcity for the inconvenient. Mrs. Finch's workroom sat above the laundry where steam clung to the walls and damp wool hung from rails, and when Alexandra entered with the folded napery, she found Arabella's yellow overskirt spread over the central table like a wounded bird, split clean at the left seam where an eager dance step had outrun its stitching. "At last," Mrs. Finch said, not unkindly, already threading a needle fine as a hair. "Hold this panel taut." Alexandra took her place at the edge and drew the fabric straight, while the seamstress worked in tiny, furious bites, and Arabella herself swept in halfway, through with Cressida at her shoulder, and the scent of rose water strong enough to turn Alexandra's empty stomach. "Do not pull too hard," Arabella warned. "That silk bruises." Cressida's gloved hand rested on the table, and the ring on her smallest finger was one Alexandra knew the way one knows an old prayer by sound. A narrow garnet cabochon in dark gold, once part of her mother's mourning set, too small for formal display, and therefore never entered in public inventories, given by her father to her mother in Aberdeen after Alexandra's birth. Lady Harbury had said years ago that loose pieces from old settings had been sold to pay coal accounts. Coal still went unpaid in Alexandra's attic. The ring gleamed warm as wine against Cressida's pale skin. Alexandra kept the silk taut and her breathing even. She had learned that naming theft without proof only armed the thief. Arabella tapped a finger against Alexandra's sleeve and smiled without warmth. "You will wear the grey tonight, the plain one. Lady Harbury says your colouring offends less in shadow." Cressida gave a small laugh. "And no ornaments, naturally. We cannot have confusion beside the Duchess." The words struck deeper because they were true and arranged to wound with precision. Every garment Alexandra owned had begun elsewhere. Arabella's cast-off walking dress narrowed at the waist and let out at the hip. Cressida's worn pelisse turned and relined, gloves with one good hand paired to another glove's surviving twin. She mended her own cuffs by candle stubs. She dyed faded ribbons in tea to pass for brown. Even her winter cloak had once belonged to a housemaid and still held the ghost of another woman's perfume in the collar seam. Once, long ago, she had possessed trunks marked A.M. in her mother's careful hand, muslin wrapped around folded linen, a dance dress with seed pearls at the neckline, a velvet mantle with horn buttons carved like thistles. Those trunks had been reallocated during an accounting of assets and never seen again, except in pieces on other bodies. Mrs. Finch bit off her thread and set down the needle. "Done! Do not breathe near it too hard." Arabella lifted the skirt and inspected the seam as if judging a servant's handwriting. "Adequate," she said. Then, turning to Alexandra with bright cruelty sharpened by boredom, "Do try not to look hungry tonight. It is unbecoming." They left in rustling layers and laughter that climbed the stairwell ahead of them. "Missy Duchess." Finch pretended to sort lace until the sound faded, then pushed a scrap of stale currant bun toward Alexandra without looking up. "For your pocket," she said. "Quickly." Alexandra took it with a whisper of thanks and hid it in her sleeve like contraband, because in Harbury House kindness had to travel disguised. By late afternoon, rain had begun to tick against the long windows, and the house shifted from preparation to performance. Lamps lit early against the darkening sky, coal scuttles ringing, doors opening and closing in precise succession as carriages came to collect trunks and flowers and musicians' cases, and Alexandra was summoned not to the hall, but to Lady Harbury's dressing-room, where an open dispatch box lay on the chaise, and the jewel chest sat on the escritoire with its lid raised. She stopped one step inside before she could prevent herself. Velvet trays gleamed under candlelight, diamonds in sprays like frost, pearls in 2 ropes, garnets in deep red clusters she recognised and did not recognise, old stones recut, old stones reset, old stones made fashionable by new claws and clasps. Lady Harbury stood before the mirror while her maid fastened a stomacher, her face composed in that polished calm that always preceded cruelty. "Close your mouth, Alexandra," she said. "You look simple." Alexandra obeyed and lowered her eyes, but not before she saw, on a bracelet turned half over near the edge of the tray, the underside of a clasp where the gold had worn thin and a tiny thistle had been stamped inside the hinge, a private maker's mark her father had shown her when she was 14 and trusted with the inventory pen for the first time. Mark the distinguishing features, Alex. Anyone can list rubies and gold. Accuracy lives in the details. Lady Harbury dismissed the maid with a tilt of her chin and picked up a packet of folded papers tied in blue ribbon. "These are notes for Mr. Pell. You will hand them to him directly. You will not read them." Alexandra took the packet. The upper sheet shifted. Through the fold she saw columns and notations in Lady Harbury's hand, then a signature at the bottom that mimicked her father's old flourish badly enough to tighten the skin at the back of her neck. Lady Harbury watched her watching and smiled. "Debts are ugly things, child. You would not understand the burden of managing them." She moved to the jewel tray and selected a pair of garnet drops with deliberate care. "Your father left confusion. I restored order. You were fed, housed, clothed. You might consider gratitude less tiring than suspicion." Alexandra's fingers closed around the paper packet until the edges cut her palm through the glove. She could have spoken then. She could have said that order built on forged names remained theft in better ink. She said nothing because accusation without witness was a gift to the accuser, and she had no witness in that room except the woman she accused. Lady Harbury stepped closer, lavender and powder and polished malice. "Tonight you will stand where I place you, beside the Duchess of Rexford. Smile if spoken to, speak only when required. If anyone asks why you are unadorned, you will say modesty becomes a dependent." The last word landed with the same practised force as a slap. Alexandra inclined her head. "Yes, Lady Harbury." "Good. And Alexandra?" Lady Harbury's voice softened, which was always more dangerous than anger. "Do not rummage in old papers. Your father's affairs are beyond you." Alexandra met her reflection in the mirror over Lady Harbury's shoulder. Pale face, dark eyes, mouth held still by effort alone. "I understand," she said, and meant that she understood exactly. The house clock struck 7 as she carried the packet to Mr. Pell and then climbed to her attic to dress, each bell note marking another degree of the trap tightening around her, and by the final stroke she stood in the grey gown Arabella had chosen, bodice plain, sleeves narrow, neckline high enough to hide the bruise at her wrist and low enough to make her bare throat obvious under ballroom light. She ate the stolen scrap of currant bun in 2 bites and drank from the ewer because no tray had been sent, Rain ran steady now. In the cracked mirror she pinned her hair with plain combs and opened the drawer where her father's brass pen lay beside the inventory scrap in his hand. She folded that scrap into a square no larger than a postage stamp and slipped it into the lining seam of her glove, pressing the fabric flat until the edge disappeared. If she was searched, they might miss it. If she lost the glove, she lost the last line that named what had been taken. A knock came hard at the door. "Carriage in 5, called a footman. "Lady Harbury says now." Alexandra blew out the candle, took her cloak, and descended through the back stair to the marble hall, where warmth gathered under chandeliers, and never reached the corners. Arabella and Cressida were already cloaked in dark velvet trimmed with jet, cheeks bright, earrings trembling with each movement. Lady Harbury stood between them in silver-grey silk, every gesture finished, every stone at her throat catching light. Around her neck lay the broad garnet collar that had once rested in Alexandra's mother's jewel chest, altered with fresh links but still unmistakable in the central cluster where one stone sat a breath lower than the others from an old repair. Alexandra felt the ground tilt and settle. She did not reach for the wall. Lady Harbury's gaze swept over her from damp hem to unadorned collarbone. Satisfaction sharpened her mouth. "There, exactly as required. You will ride with us and remain at my left when we arrive. You are a shadow tonight, decorative, silent, and useful." The butler opened the front door. Cold air rushed in with rain and carriage lantern smoke. As Alexandra stepped toward the waiting coach, she looked once at the jewel chest key glinting from Lady Harbury's reticule clasp, and knew, with a clarity that hurt like winter breath, that the final pieces from her mother's chest were gone, not lost, not misplaced, gone into other hands while she stood in borrowed grey and called it duty. Rain struck the carriage roof in hard, impatient taps as Alexandra climbed in after Lady Harbury, gathering her grey skirts away from the slick brass step while a footman shut the door on the night and sealed her into perfume, velvet, and accusation. Arabella and Cressida sat opposite, their cloaks parted just enough to display jewelled throats, their smiles bright with the kind of anticipation that had never once included her. Lady Harbury held the reticule with the jewel key against her lap, as if she feared theft from the very air. The carriage lurched forward, wheels cut through standing water. London slid past in flashes of gaslight and black stone, blurred by rain and speed. Alexandra braced her sore heel against the carriage floor and fixed her gaze on the narrow seam where window curtain met frame, because if she looked at the garnet collar on Lady Harbury's neck for one moment too long, she would lose control of her face. By the time they reached the streets near the assembly rooms, traffic had thickened into a glittering crawl. Carriages stood wheel to wheel beneath lanterns and umbrellas. Grooms shouted. Horses tossed their heads and stamped at puddles deep enough to swallow ankles. Music leaked in thin threads from the lit facade ahead. The grand ball had begun. Lady Harbury rapped the roof with her cane handle for speed, then hissed under her breath when their coach halted again. "We will miss our entrance," she said, as if delay were a personal insult offered by the weather. Another jolt came, sharp and crooked. The left side of the carriage dipped. Voices rose outside. A horse screamed. Then came the sound that cut through everything else, heavy and human and wrong. A thud followed by a broken cry. The footman opened the door into rain and confusion. One of the Harbury grooms had gone down between carriage shafts and wheel pinned at the leg, face white under rainwater and street mud. Men stood around him in a tightening ring, each waiting for someone of lower consequence to act first. The horse nearest him strained against its harness, eyes rolling, iron shoes scraping sparks against stone. Lady Harbury's gloved hand shot out and seized Alexandra's sleeve. "Stay in this carriage," she snapped. "Do not make a scene." Alexandra was already moving. She tore free, jumped to the flooded street, and dropped to her knees beside the groom before cold could register. Mud soaked through silk and petticoat at once. The man's breath came in ragged gasps. Dark blood ran from a deep cut just below his knee, where metal had struck and torn cloth and skin. She did not allow herself to think past the next motion. She stripped off one glove, ripped the lower edge of her grey overskirt with both hands, and twisted the cloth into a pressure band while rain plastered loose strands of dark hair across her face. "Look at me," she told the groom, voice low and steady. "Stay awake. You hear me? Stay with me." He groaned and tried to turn. She pressed him flat with her forearm. "Do not move. You will worsen it." From the carriage window above her, Lady Harbury leaned out, lavender and fury spilling into the rain. "Alexandra, get up this instant. You are filthy. You are drawing every eye in the street." Alexandra did not look up. She wrapped the torn silk hard around the wound, shoved knuckles into the knot to increase pressure, and felt warm blood soak her fingers through the rain. "Lift the shaft," she called to the nearest coachman. "2 men now, on my count." No one moved. She raised her voice. "Now!" Boots struck stone. A tall figure cut through the ring of onlookers with the efficient force of someone obeyed by habit rather than request. He came out of rain and lantern shadow in a dark greatcoat, broad shoulders carrying weather, as if weather had no claim on him. He did not waste words on astonishment. He looked once at the trapped leg, once at Alexandra's hands, and began issuing orders. "You too, take the horse head and keep it steady." The men moved. "You, with the blue cravat, get a surgeon from inside." A runner bolted toward the lit doors. He dropped to one knee opposite Alexandra, close enough that she saw rain beading on his dark lashes, and the old pale line of a scar near his temple. His eyes were the colour of deep water under stormlight. Cold, exact, taking in everything. "Hold pressure," he said. "Do not move him." "I know," she answered, and tightened her grip as the groom cried out. He glanced at her bare hand, the raw knuckles, the torn fabric twisted red, then to the bruise half hidden above her glove line, where Lady Harbury's fingers had marked her the day before. His jaw set harder. "You are injured!" The words landed between command and accusation. She kept her focus on the man on the stones. "I am late, Your Grace." Recognition came a breath afterward, like ice dropped down her spine. Duke of Ashcombe. Nathaniel Ashcombe. Everyone in London knew the title, if not the man. His estates spanned half a county. His temper, people said, was colder than January water. He was not expected to kneel in mud beside a dependent in borrowed grey. His mouth did not soften. "You are bleeding through your sleeve." "Not mine." "Your wrist, your heel, I can see both." Heat flared in her face despite the rain. "The groom first." For the first time his gaze held hers fully. Then he gave a short nod, once, as if confirming a fact he had not expected to find. "On 3, he called to the men at the shaft. "Lift!" They heaved. Wood rose. Weight shifted. Alexandra slid her left arm under the groom's shoulders, while the Duke freed the trapped leg and lowered it carefully onto folded coats someone had finally thrown forward. The groom cried out again, then sagged, breath shuddering. "Stay awake," Alexandra repeated. "Look at me. That is it." The surgeon arrived with a leather case and 2 assistants cursing the rain and then stopping short when he saw who knelt in the street. The Duke stood in one smooth movement, and stepped back only far enough to give room while retaining command of the scene. "Arterial bleed controlled," Alexandra said, not looking up, hands still locked over the improvised bandage. "Possible fracture. He was pinned under the near shaft." The surgeon blinked once at her, then nodded and took over. She released pressure gradually when told, fingers shaking from effort at last. Lady Harbury's voice cut through the crowd again, sharp with social terror. "Your Grace, forgive this absurd display. The girl is overzealous. She forgets her place." The Duke turned toward the carriage window. Rain ran off his coat in dark lines. "Her place at present is where competence is required, Lady Harbury." The silence that followed was immediate and total. Alexandra got to her feet slowly, knees stiff, skirts ruined to the thigh. Mud dragged at the torn hem. Her pulse hammered against her throat. She wanted only to become small enough to vanish into the rain. Instead, she stood under 50 watching faces, while the surgeon bound the groom properly and called for a stretcher. The Duke looked at her once more. "Can you stand?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Can you walk?" "Yes." A beat passed. His gaze dropped briefly to her blood-stained hand, then returned to her face. "Then go in the side. Dry your hands before you touch anything else." Lady Harbury answered for her from the carriage, brittle with forced laughter. "Miss MacDonald will do as she is told." The Duke did not turn. "I was not addressing you." He moved away to speak with the surgeon and stablemen, already managing payment, transport, and witness statements with the clean precision of military drill. Alexandra stared for one suspended moment, rain in her eyes, then bent to retrieve her abandoned glove from a puddle. The inventory scrap remained hidden in the lining. Still there, still dry. She shoved the glove back on with clumsy fingers and climbed into the carriage without assistance. Inside, Arabella recoiled from the mud on Alexandra's skirt, as if contamination were contagious. Cressida stared with hard fascination, then looked away. Lady Harbury shut the door herself, each motion controlled to the edge of violence. "You have humiliated me before half the city," she said softly, the softness worse than a slap. "When we enter, you will not speak unless spoken to. You will keep your eyes lowered. You will remember that your theatrics have cost me dear." Alexandra sat very straight, rainwater dripping from her sleeves onto the carriage floor. Her hands had begun to shake now that there was nothing left to hold. "The groom would have bled out." Lady Harbury's smile did not reach her eyes. "Servants are replaceable. Reputation is not." The coach rolled forward at last, through the crush to the assembly room's entrance. Footmen opened doors into warmth so bright it hurt. Music swelled. Chandeliers threw light across polished marble and damp cloaks and powdered shoulders. Names were announced in ringing tones that travelled up the staircase like trumpets. Lady Harbury gathered her silk and stepped out first, magnificent, composed, every garnet at her throat lit like embers. Arabella followed, then Cressida, each transformed by candlelight into daughters of consequence. Alexandra descended last. Wet grey clung to her calves. Her hem was ripped and dark with street mud. Her throat was bare. Strangers looked, registered disparity, and looked away with practised speed. At the top of the stairs, Lady Harbury paused only long enough to murmur without moving her lips, "Left of the Duchess. Smile if commanded." They entered the ballroom as one formation, the orchestra in full movement, conversation rising and falling like surf against stone. The Duchess of Rexford stood near the central pillar in pale blue satin, surrounded by admirers, and the sight of her stopped Alexandra's breath. Around the Duchess's neck lay her mother's garnet collar, reset in newer gold, but unmistakable in the lower central drop. Matching bracelets circled her wrists. Garnet earrings swung against her throat each time she turned her head to receive compliments. Rich red against white skin. Stolen history displayed as fashion. Alexandra felt her body sway once and held herself upright by force alone. A footman announced, "Lady Harbury and family." They moved into the circle. Lady Harbury's laughter rang light and false as she offered compliments and curtsies. Alexandra took her assigned place half a step behind and to the left of the Duchess, exactly where a decorative shadow should stand. Across the room, near the card tables, the Duke of Ashcombe had just removed his gloves. He looked up at the sound of Lady Harbury's name. His gaze crossed the ballroom, found Alexandra in one line, and did not move away. She saw the precise instant his attention shifted from her mud-stiff skirt to the Duchess's wrists, throat, and ears, then back to Alexandra's face as she flinched despite herself at the flash of garnet under candlelight. He had seen. The orchestra drove into the next measure. Conversations resumed around them, unaware of the fault line opening at the centre of the room. Alexandra kept her chin level, her hands folded, and her expression composed, while her pulse struck hard against her bare throat, each beat a warning bell counting down to midnight. The orchestra drove into the next figure, and the room broke into motion around Alexandra with the ruthless grace of a machine that did not care who was caught in its gears. Gentlemen bowed, ladies curtsied, slippers turned on polished boards, laughter rose bright as glass. Lady Harbury angled her fan and spoke to the Duchess of Rexford with intimate ease, as if garnets had always belonged on her side of every bargain. Alexandra stood where she had been placed, half a pace behind, damp hem cooling against her ankles, bare throat exposed under 100 lights. A young viscount with careful curls approached their group and bowed to Arabella first, then to Cressida, then, after the smallest pause, to Lady Harbury's fan, as if it were a person of greater consequence than the woman beside it. His eyes touched Alexandra and slid away. "Miss Harbury, may I claim the first country dance?" Arabella smiled and gave him her hand. Cressida accepted another partner a moment later. When Alexandra shifted to clear their path, the second gentleman recoiled faintly at the mud-stain still dark on her skirt and said, in a voice meant to be kind and achieved only cruel, "I beg pardon. I had mistaken—" He did not finish. He bowed to no one and stepped back into the moving set. Lady Harbury did not turn her head. "Do try to remain still," she murmured. "You distract." Alexandra answered, "Yes, Lady Harbury," and kept her eyes on the dance, while heat and shame rose together beneath her skin. She had been refused before. She had been ignored before. But tonight refusal had witnesses, and witnesses made humiliation heavier. When the figure turned and the dancers opened a lane between them, she saw the Duke of Ashcombe standing near the card tables, one hand behind his back, the other resting against a chair rail. He was not dancing. He was watching the centre of the room with that unnerving stillness of his, eyes moving from Lady Harbury's throat to the Duchess's wrists, to Alexandra's face, and back again, assembling facts as if they were lines in a ledger. A footman passed with wine. Lady Harbury took a glass and set another into Alexandra's hand without looking at her. "Deliver that to the Duchess. Do not spill." Alexandra stepped forward through the edge of the dance and offered the crystal. The Duchess of Rexford turned with an easy smile, fair and unguarded, and accepted it. "Thank you, child," the Duchess said. "You are shivering. Have they placed you too near the doors?" "No, Your Grace." The Duchess's bracelet slid down her wrist as she lifted the glass. Candlelight struck the inner hinge of one clasp. There, no larger than a fingernail, sat the thistle crest, worn smooth at one leaf point by years of use. Alexandra's chest tightened so sharply she had to lock her knees to remain upright. The Duchess noticed her gaze and touched the bracelet lightly. Old stones, these. Lady Harbury was most persuasive. She said they came from a Highland estate sold in distress. Alexandra heard herself answer before caution could intervene. They did come from a Highland estate, Your Grace. The Duchess tilted her head, uncertain whether she had heard insolence or pain. Did they? Lady Harbury's fan snapped shut. Miss MacDonald has a sentimental imagination. Pay no attention. Alexandra curtsied and stepped back into place. The music swelled again. Her pulse beat at her throat like a second instrument in the room. By 11:30, the ballroom air had thickened with heat, beeswax, crushed flowers, and the metallic scent of too many candles burning at once. Lady Harbury sent Alexandra twice to fetch shawls, once to carry a note to Mr. Pell, once to stand by the card-room door in case Mrs. Quillen required smelling salts. Each errand was a small assertion of rank. Each return brought the Garnets back into view, brighter under later candles, as if theft gained legitimacy with every hour it remained unchallenged. Near the long gallery arch, as she carried an empty salver toward the service corridor, a low voice stopped her. "Miss MacDonald!" She turned. The Duke stood half in shadow beside a marble niche, dark coat unmarked now, rain dried from his hair, expression carved to severity. "Your Grace!" He looked once at the salver, took it from her hand and set it on a side table. "Walk with me, 10 paces only." Protocol said, "Refuse." Fear said, "Refuse." Something steadier said, "Listen." She followed him to the narrower passage between the music room and the old portrait corridor, where noise from the ballroom fell to a muffled throb. He spoke without preface. "The bracelets and collar, they are yours." It was not a question. "They were my mother's," Alexandra said, "by right and by inventory." "Proof?" She drew a breath and kept her voice level. "A list in my father's hand. Piece by piece, clasp marks and repairs noted. I have one fragment hidden. The larger book was taken. Taken by Lady Harbury." "Yes." His jaw shifted once. "Can you identify a distinguishing mark no jeweller could invent this evening?" "Yes. The lower centre stone in the collar sits fractionally low from an old Aberdeen repair. The left bracelet hinge carries a thistle stamp. Inside, one leaf flattened." His gaze held hers, cold and exact. "I have seen both." Silence pressed between them. Then he said, "The magistrate is in attendance tonight for gaming complaints in the card-room annex. If you speak before midnight, he can take a sworn statement and secure the jewels where they stand." The words should have brought relief. Instead, dread turned in her stomach. "In the ballroom," she said, "before everyone." "Visibility protects evidence. It also ruins a woman who may be innocent." His eyes narrowed faintly. "The Duchess wears stolen property. She may have purchased it in good faith. If I accuse her in public, her name carries the stain first. Lady Harbury's can come after. Mine will not matter at all." A beat passed. He had no patience for hesitation. She could see it in the set of his mouth. But he did not interrupt. Alexandra lifted her chin. "If there is to be truth tonight, I ask one thing. Let me speak to the Duchess in private first. Let me show her what she wears and why. If she refuses, I will go to the magistrate at once. That gives Lady Harbury time to move the pieces. I can prevent that if you keep her occupied." He studied her face as if weighing not courage but precision. At last he said, "You are giving your enemy mercy she has not earned." "I am giving another woman fairness she has." For the first time something shifted in his expression, not softness but recognition. He inclined his head once. "Very well, 5 minutes. I will hold Lady Harbury at the card tables. You will not be alone." I am always alone, Your Grace." "Not for the next 5 minutes." He stepped aside, and the corridor felt abruptly colder. She curtsied and moved back toward the ballroom before her knees could weaken. The Duchess of Rexford stood near the conservatory doors now, speaking with an elderly baronet, and laughing at something she likely did not find amusing. Lady Harbury had turned toward the card-room, drawn by the Duke's arrival there, and the possibility of being seen in conversation with him. Alexandra saw him take position at the green baize table and address Lady Harbury with formal courtesy that held her in place like a pin through silk. He did not look toward Alexandra again. She approached the Duchess and curtsied. "Your Grace, forgive the liberty. Lady Harbury asked that I attend you in the withdrawing room. The heat here has brought on your headache." The Duchess blinked. "My headache?" Alexandra kept her eyes lowered. "You mentioned it to Mrs. Quillen earlier, Your Grace." That, at least, was true. The Duchess touched her temple, uncertain, then nodded. Yes, perhaps I did. Very well." They moved through a side door into a smaller drawing room, hung in faded blue, set aside for ladies needing quiet, loose laces, or a moment away from scrutiny. Only one maid stood by the hearth arranging fresh water. At a glance from the Duchess, she withdrew to the corridor and shut the door softly. The silence after the ballroom noise felt almost violent. The Duchess crossed to a chair and sat. "Now then, child, what is this truly?" Alexandra stood with both hands clasped at her waist to hide their tremor. "Your Grace, I ask pardon in advance for my boldness. I will be brief and factual. Proceed." "The garnet pieces you wear tonight belong to my mother, Elspeth MacDonald. They were listed in my father's estate inventory with identifying marks. I can name them without touching you. The collar's centre drop set too low by 1 fraction from an old repair. The left bracelet clasp stamped inside with a thistle, and 1 earring post slightly shorter than its pair." The Duchess's face hardened, not in anger yet, but in alarm. "Those are specific claims." "Yes, Your Grace. And you choose to make them here rather than before witnesses." "Because I do not believe you a thief." A long pause. The Duchess set down her fan. "You had better be very certain of your next sentence." Alexandra swallowed once. "If I am wrong, I will accept whatever censure you decide. If I am right, then you have been deceived by the person who sold these stones, and you deserve to know before she names you complicit." Colour drained from the Duchess's cheeks in a visible tide. "Lady Harbury sold me these jewels through her broker 6 weeks ago. She said she had authority over a distressed relation's effects." "I am that relation." The Duchess stared at her, then rose slowly. "Come here." Alexandra stepped closer. "Unfasten this," the Duchess said, turning her wrist. "If there is a crest, we will both see it." Alexandra's fingers felt clumsy against the tiny hook. She forced them steady, opened the clasp, and turned it toward the candle. The thistle sat there, worn at 1 leaf, undeniable. The Duchess drew in a sharp breath. "Dear God!" Alexandra did not answer. She removed her right glove, reached into the seam she had stitched, and drew out the folded scrap of paper, edges softened by use. She handed it over with both hands. The Duchess read by candlelight, lips moving over the entries. Necklace, pair of drops, 2 bracelets, brooch with thistle setting. She reached the line of her own bracelet description and closed her eyes briefly. "This is your father's hand." "Yes, Your Grace." "And Lady Harbury keeps the full ledger?" "Yes." The Duchess opened her eyes and met Alexandra's gaze fully for the first time. "Why are you not screaming in the ballroom?" "Because screaming would have pleased Lady Harbury. because dignity was the last possession no one had managed to lock away, because shame, once public, never returned whole. Alexandra said only, "Noise is not evidence." The Duchess gave a short, unsteady exhale that might have been the start of a laugh in another life. "No, it is not." She began removing the bracelet, then the second. "Take these." Alexandra stepped back at once. "No, Your Grace, not into my hands. Let them be witnessed and sealed properly. I ask only that you confirm what you saw." "Of course." At that precise moment the withdrawing room door flew open hard enough to strike the wall. Lady Harbury entered in a storm of silver silk and lavender, eyes blazing, Mr. Pell 2 steps behind her, and already pale. "What is the meaning of this?" Lady Harbury demanded. Her gaze landed on the opened clasp in the Duchess's hand, then on the inventory scrap, then on Alexandra's ungloved fingers. Fury sharpened to panic. "You little viper! You are attempting theft!" Alexandra did not move. "No, Lady Harbury." "Silence!" Lady Harbury advanced, voice rising. "Your Grace, she is unstable. Grief damaged her judgment years ago. She invents family claims to anything she sees. Mr. Pell, fetch a footman. She is to be removed." The Duchess turned, cold now in a way Alexandra had not seen in her before. "You will lower your voice in my presence." Lady Harbury faltered for half a beat, then recovered. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I am distressed for your safety. My safety appears to have been endangered by your broker, not by this young woman." Lady Harbury's face changed again, calculations racing beneath powder and composure. "Miss MacDonald has forged papers before. She steals correspondence. She—" "Liar!" The word came from the doorway, low and precise. The Duke of Ashcombe stood there with rain-dark eyes and stillness like a drawn blade. He had no need to raise his voice. He crossed the threshold in 3 measured steps and stopped beside Alexandra, not touching her, simply occupying the space between her and Lady Harbury with unmistakable intent. "I witnessed the exchange," he said. "Miss MacDonald made no accusation in public, no attempt to seize property, and no statement beyond verifiable detail." Lady Harbury's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Your Grace, surely you do not understand her history." "I understand records," he said. "I understand marks, inside clasps. I understand forged signatures." Her hand lifted toward Alexandra with the old reflex of command and strike combined. He caught her wrist mid-air without looking away from Alexandra's face, held it for one suspended beat, then released it as if contact itself offended him. "Stand beside me," he said to Alexandra. She moved before fear could argue. He shifted half a pace, placing her behind the line of his shoulder, and addressed the corridor beyond the open door. "Send for the magistrate, now!" A footman, already waiting under orders she had not heard given, ran. The footman's steps faded down the corridor, and the room held its breath around the sound of retreating urgency. Alexandra could hear the ballroom through 2 closed doors. Violins, laughter, the soft thunder of many feet moving in pattern. Inside the withdrawing room, no one moved at all. Lady Harbury stood with one hand half lifted, as if command could still be exerted by habit alone. The Duchess of Rexford held the unfolded inventory scrap with both hands, and stared at the paper as though it had changed language while she watched. Mr. Pell hovered near the threshold, face damp, eyes fixed on the carpet. The Duke remained where he had placed himself, a solid line between Alexandra and the woman who had ruled her life by hunger, ridicule, and stolen keys. Rain had dried on his coat. Mud still marked the cuff where he had knelt in the street. He did not release the room back to motion. Lady Harbury found her voice first. "Your Grace, this is grotesque. You are lending your name to a servant girl's delusions. I insist you reconsider before this becomes public." He turned his head a fraction. "It is already public. A footman has run for a magistrate from your shout alone." "I shouted because she manipulated her grace." The Duchess looked up at that, calm now in a way that carried rank like steel under silk. "You will not speak for me, Lady Harbury." Lady Harbury's mouth hardened. "Your Grace, I acted in good faith. I conveyed items from a family burdened by debt. I have receipts." Alexandra felt her stomach twist. Receipts could be written, signatures could be copied. She had seen both. The Duke spoke before panic could gather strength. "Then you will present them quietly, under oath." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The authority in those 4 words rearranged the room. Mr. Pell cleared his throat. "Your Grace, perhaps this matter can be deferred until morning. The hour is late." "Guests, the hour is precisely why it will not be deferred," the Duke said. "Evidence moves faster than dawn." The Duchess folded the inventory scrap once, careful at each edge, and held it out to Alexandra. "Keep this on your person. It does not leave your hand unless the magistrate requests it directly." Alexandra accepted it and tucked it into her glove with fingers that had begun to tremble again. She hated the tremor. It made her feel young and exposed and less credible than the silk and titles around her. She pressed thumb to forefinger until the shaking eased. Lady Harbury saw the movement and smiled, thin and poisonous. "Observe her, Your Grace. Hysterical already." The Duke's gaze moved to Alexandra's hand. "No, cold." The single word landed harder than argument. He looked toward the hearth, then toward the chair nearest it. "Sit," he said. It was a command. It was also care-stripped to bone. Alexandra did not sit. "I am able to stand, Your Grace." His eyes returned to her face. "I did not ask what you could endure." That sentence entered her like warmth and pain at once. She had built a life out of endurance. To hear it named as something other than duty unsettled her more than accusation. She sat. Lady Harbury gave a sharp, incredulous laugh. "How touching! Shall we fetch a blanket as well?" The Duke ignored her completely. He removed one glove, then the other, and placed them on the table beside Alexandra's chair, as if marking territory no one else might cross. In the corridor, hurried steps returned. A moment later the footman appeared breathless, with a narrow-shouldered man in sober black behind him. Magistrate Ellery. Alexandra recognised him from distance only. A legal face often seen at charity dinners and public inquests, never this close. He bowed to the Duchess first, then to the Duke. "Your Grace, Your Grace, I was informed of an urgent property dispute." "Forgery and theft," said the Duke, "with physical evidence present." Magistrate Ellery glanced around the room and took in Lady Harbury's rigid posture, the Duchess's bare wrist where one bracelet had been removed, Alexandra's mud-stained hem, and the Duke standing like a locked door at her side. His expression sharpened. "I will need sequence and witnesses," he said. "Given the setting, I recommend immediate securing of property and statements in the card-room annex." Lady Harbury stepped forward at once. "I object. I am a hostess in this assembly. I will not be paraded like a criminal based on a dependence fantasy." The magistrate met her eyes without emotion. "You may object in writing after compliance." Her fan snapped open and shut once. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes," he said. "At present that does not improve your position." The quarter-hour bell in the ballroom corridor struck once, then again thin and metallic through the walls. 11:45, 15 minutes to midnight. The Duke spoke to the magistrate. "The jewels are on the Duchess's person. She purchased through Lady Harbury's broker, under representations now contested by inventory detail and identifying marks. The magistrate nodded. Then let us avoid spectacle. We proceed now. The Duchess rose, already unclasping the second bracelet. I will walk with you and surrender each piece to sealed custody until ownership is ruled. Miss MacDonald will identify marks in my presence. Lady Harbury may present documentation she claims to possess. Lady Harbury's eyes flashed. You cannot mean to strip me before half of London. The Duchess looked at her directly. I mean to avoid being stripped of my name by association with theft. They moved into the corridor as a unit the way military escorts moved prisoners in wartime sketches Alexandra had seen in old newspapers. No wasted motion, no conversation, no room to bolt. The Duke walked beside Alexandra, close enough that the heat from his sleeve touched hers through damp fabric. He did not offer his arm. He did not leave distance for propriety either. Each step made clear that if Lady Harbury lunged again, she would not reach her. When they entered the card-room annex, conversation died in widening circles. Green baize tables stood under lower chandeliers, candles reflected in glass decanters, cards paused in mid-air between finger and thumb. Men turned. Women near the doorway leaned in. The rumour moved faster than language. Something had broken. The magistrate took position at the central table and addressed the room in a carrying voice. Play is suspended. This annex is now a legal space pending immediate statements. A murmur ran through the watchers. Someone laughed nervously and was hushed. The Duke did not permit Alexandra to drift to the edge where she would vanish by reflex. Here, he said, indicating the place at his right hand. She stood there, bare throat and grey gown, and torn hem plainly visible under unforgiving light. Lady Harbury remained opposite, silver silk immaculate, chin high. She looked for allies in the crowd and found eyes turning away. The magistrate began with the Duchess. She removed the garnet collar and earrings with controlled fingers and laid each piece on a folded linen napkin. The jewels seemed darker without candlelight at a throat to animate them. Old red, deep as claret. Alexandra's chest tightened at the sight, not because of value, because she remembered her mother fastening that collar in a mirror, smiling at Alexandra over her shoulder, saying that Highland stones were stubborn and would outlast fashion and men alike. Miss MacDonald, said the magistrate, identify what you can. She stepped forward. Her knees felt uncertain for one breath, then locked into steadiness. She picked up the first bracelet and opened the hinge to show the thistle stamp inside. MacDonald crest, she said, flattened leaf at the left edge from where, recorded in my father's inventory. She set it down and touched the collar's centre drop with one finger. Lower set stone, repaired in Aberdeen after a broken claw. The solder line sits beneath, slightly off-centre. The magistrate bent to inspect. Confirmed, Lady Harbury cut in. Any jeweller could claim such things after close observation. Alexandra looked up at last and met her gaze. Oh, you could describe them before touching them? Silence followed that, heavy, watching. The magistrate turned to Lady Harbury. Your receipts. She produced papers from her reticule with a hand that stayed almost steady. Almost. He read the first page, then the second, then asked, Original broker signature. On the reverse. He turned it over, studied, and his expression shifted by 1 degree toward certainty. This hand does not match prior filings from Mr. Cormet, Lady Harbury's voice sharpened. You cannot determine that at a glance. No, he said, I determine at a glance that I should seize these documents for examination. He held out his hand. She did not move. The Duke spoke very quietly. Comply. Her fingers tightened around the papers. For one instant, Alexandra saw a future in which Lady Harbury tore them, swallowed them, set fire to them, laughed and called Alexandra mad, and half the room agreed because silk had always been believed over hunger. Then Lady Harbury released the documents. The magistrate passed them to his clerk with instructions for wax seals. All jewellery and papers are secured pending formal charge. A man near the doorway whispered, "Charge?" and another answered, "Against Lady Harbury." The whisper moved outward like ink in water. Lady Harbury heard it and straightened to full social height, fury burning through her composure. "You will regret this, Alexandra. Do you imagine this room will receive you after tonight? Do you imagine a name can be washed clean once dragged through mud?" Alexandra felt the old reflex to lower her eyes. She did not yield to it. Before she could speak, the Duke stepped forward one pace. He did not look at Lady Harbury. He looked at the room. "Attend carefully," he said. The murmurs stopped as if cut. He kept his gaze level across titled men and jewelled women, and the servants pressed to walls pretending not to hear. "These jewels are hers," he said, each word placed like iron. "This fraud is recorded, and no one will touch Miss MacDonald again." The statement did not ring like a toast. It landed like a verdict. Alexandra felt the floor steady under her for the first time that night. Heat rose behind her eyes, sudden and dangerous. She blinked once hard and kept her face composed. Lady Harbury made a sound between outrage and disbelief. "You cannot dictate society, Your Grace." He turned then, finally, and gave her the full cold force of his attention. "No, I can dictate what occurs under law in this room. You will remain while charges are entered." The magistrate nodded to two uniformed officers, summoned from the street entrance. They took position, one at each side of Lady Harbury, respectful but immovable. Arabella and Cressida appeared in the annex doorway, pale and wide-eyed, their beauty wrecked by terror. Arabella began, "Mamma!" and stopped when the officer raised a hand. No one moved to comfort them. No one moved at all. The Duchess of Rexford stepped toward Alexandra, now bare of garnets, throat marked only by faint red impressions where stones had rested. "Miss MacDonald," she said, voice low but clear enough to carry, "I owe you apology, and I give it now before witnesses. I wore what was not mine. I will return every piece and provide sworn testimony to my purchase." Alexandra bowed her head. "Thank you, Your Grace." The Duchess held her gaze. "You protected my name when you had every right to destroy it. I will not forget." That might have been the most extraordinary sentence of the night, yet Alexandra could barely process it. She was aware only of breath moving in and out of her lungs, and the Duke still standing at her side, not stepping away, though the immediate danger had passed. His stillness was not indifference, it was decision. He would remain until she was safe enough to stand without him. The magistrate began formal dictation to his clerk. "Statement of complaint by Miss Alexandra MacDonald regarding alleged theft, fraudulent conveyance, and forged estate instruments." Words stacked into law. Names entered ink. The clock advanced. Alexandra answered each question with dates, marks, and facts. No ornament. No plea. When asked how long the disputed property had been out of her possession, she said, "Since my father's death and the transfer of keys to Lady Harbury's custody." When asked whether she had ever authorised sale, she said, "Never." When asked whether threats had been made against her if she spoke, she paused only once, then answered, "Yes." Lady Harbury hissed, "Lies!" but the word had lost force. Too many people had seen her hand lifted. Too many had heard the Duke catch her without looking away from Alexandra's face. At last the magistrate sanded the final line and blew lightly across the page. Initial statement entered. Lady Harbury, you are charged pending full hearing and held to immediate surety. Officers. The officers stepped in. Lady Harbury did not scream. She drew herself up and moved with brittle dignity between them, silver skirts whispering over parquet, lavender scent trailing behind her like the ghost of authority. At the threshold she twisted to look back at Alexandra, hatred cold and bright. This is not over. The magistrate answered before Alexandra could. For tonight it is. Lady Harbury was led away. Sound returned to the annex in fragments. Exhalations, chair legs scraping, someone beginning to speak and thinking better of it. The orchestra in the distant ballroom had faltered, then resumed with forced cheer. Midnight struck while the officers' footsteps faded down the corridor. 12 hard bells. Alexandra stood very still beside the table where her mother's garnets lay on linen under seal, and understood in her bones that an old order had broken in public and could not be mended in private. Only then did the Duke turn toward her fully. Up close, his face was as controlled as ever, but she saw the minute tension at his jaw, the pulse at his throat, the damp curl of hair at his temple where rain had never quite dried. He looked at her bruised wrist, at her torn hem, at her bare neck. "You are shaking again," he said. "I am aware. Come away from this room." She should have refused. She should have thanked him with proper distance and retreated into whatever corner remained available to disgraced dependents after midnight scandals. Instead, she found herself answering with a truth she had not planned to utter. "If I step away, I may wake and find this undone." His expression altered by the smallest measure. Not quite a smile. Something graver. "I do not undo what I have set in motion," he said. The words settled over her like a cloak heavier than wool and warmer than fire. He held out his hand, not to claim, not to display, but to steady. "Come," he said. "You will witness the seals placed in the strong box yourself." She looked at that offered hand for one heartbeat, then placed her fingers in it and let him lead her toward the magistrate's desk, where Law at last was being made to remember her name. She let him guide her to the magistrate's desk, and she watched as each garnet was wrapped in clean linen, named aloud, and locked in the iron strong-box under 2 wax seals, one stamped with the court mark, and one with the Duchess of Rexford's signet, while her own inventory scrap was copied in full by the clerk, and returned to her glove only after Magistrate Ellery signed the margin to confirm receipt and return. "State that you witnessed the sealing," Ellery said. "I witnessed each piece," Alexandra answered. "Necklace, pair of drops, 2 bracelets, and brooch clasp fitting, all present." The Duke stood beside her, still as carved granite. Lady Harbury was already gone from sight, but the shape of her rage remained in the room like smoke after a lamp is blown out. When the strong-box lid shut with a hard metallic strike, Alexandra turned to him at last. Her throat felt scraped raw. "Why would you do this?" He did not answer at once. The pause stretched one full breath, then 2. His gaze held hers without flinching. "Because I have been watching you endure what should have broken anyone." The sentence entered her like shock. She looked away first, not from fear but because tears threatened, and she would not give them a public stage. Before dawn, Magistrate Ellery took her signed deposition in a side office that smelled of wet wool, sealing wax, and ink. The Duke remained in the corridor by the door, and did not sit. When the clerk read back her statement, every detail stood where she had placed it. The thistle inside the clasp, the lowered stone, the broker paper with mismatched hand, the forged slope of her father's signature. No embellishment, no plea, Facts only. Ellery then called Mr. Pell from the annex. Mr. Pell entered with shaking fingers and eyes that refused to rise above the edge of the desk. He had served Harbury House for 20 years. He had watched everything. He had said little. "Mr. Pell," Ellery said, "you are reminded you answer under oath." "Yes, sir." "Were estate ledgers altered after Mr. MacDonald's death?" Mr. Pell swallowed. Silence dragged. Then his shoulders bent as if age had found him in one instant. "Yes." "By whom?" "By Lady Harbury's instruction." His voice cracked. "She ordered pages recopied, debts increased, payments invented. She had me fetch older signatures for practice." Alexandra did not move. She had expected denial. Confession felt stranger. Ellery's pen scratched rapidly. "Did Miss MacDonald authorise disposal of her mother's jewel property?" "No, sir, never." She objected. Lady Harbury said the girl's objections were grief madness and not to be entered. The Duke's jaw tightened once, the only visible sign he had heard what she heard. By the second afternoon after the ball, rain had cleared and a hard winter light lay over Harbury House when Alexandra returned with court officers, Magistrate Ellery and the Duke. No carriage door was opened for Lady Harbury this time. She had been moved to holding rooms, pending surety hearing. Arabella and Cressida met them in the front hall in morning dark day dresses, faces colourless, hands clenched around handkerchiefs they did not use. Cressida spoke first, voice thin. "Are we to be turned into the street?" Ellery answered, "Your residence is not at issue today. Property chain is." Arabella looked at Alexandra then, truly looked, perhaps for the first time in years. Shame flickered, then hardened into self-preservation. She stepped aside. The officers requested keys. None were offered. Ellery turned to Alexandra. "You observed a key in Lady Harbury's possession on ball night?" "Yes." He held up a tagged item bag. Inside lay the reticule clasp key taken at arrest. "Identify." Alexandra nodded. "That is it." They climbed to Lady Harbury's dressing room. Lavender still hung in the air. The jewel chest sat on the escritoire where Alexandra had seen it before, lid closed now, brasswork gleaming in winter sun. Ellery inserted the key. The lock gave with a small final click. Inside were trays of unset stones, old clasps, receipts, and 2 folded packets bound in blue ribbon. The colour struck Alexandra like a hand to the chest. The same ribbon Lady Harbury had given her with instructions not to read. Ellery opened the first packet. Ledgers, original pages and copied pages together. Ink differences plain even to a tired eye. The second packet held correspondence with the broker and 1 draft sale list headed MacDonald Effects in Lady Harbury's hand. Alexandra stood very still while officers logged each sheet. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in yellowed muslin, lay her mother's mourning ring and the small brooch with thistle setting that had been omitted from the Duchess transaction. Alexandra reached for neither until Ellery nodded. "Identify these as well." She lifted the ring. The garnet was dark as old wine, the inner band engraved with initials worn soft by years of wear, E.M. and A.M. Her fingers shook once and steadied. "These were not sold," she said quietly. "No," Ellery replied. "They were concealed." In the corridor outside, Arabella began to cry in small, furious breaths. Cressida did not comfort her. She watched the officers carry ledgers past and whispered, almost to herself, "She told us there was no money left." Alexandra heard. She did not answer. Some realizations arrived too late to be useful, and too early to be kind. 3 days passed before the groom from the carriage accident could be seen. Alexandra found him in a convalescent ward behind the assembly stables, legs splintered, colour returned, temper already improving. He tried to rise when she entered. "Do not," she said. He settled back with embarrassment and gratitude fighting across his face. "Miss MacDonald, I owe you my life." "You owe the surgeon your patience," she answered, "and the Duke your wages while you recover." The groom blinked. His Grace paid 3 months in advance and ordered my mother a coal delivery. Said only that competent men are not to be wasted. The words struck her with quiet force. Command again, shaped as care. By the first week of December, the surety hearing convened in a panelled chamber off Chancery Lane. The Duchess of Rexford arrived punctually, unjewelled, and gave her statement with clipped precision. Purchase made in good faith, provenance misrepresented, property surrendered immediately upon credible claim. Mrs. Quillen also appeared, gloved and severe, and confirmed she had heard Lady Harbury boast of obtaining Highland garnets from a dependent too meek to contest. It was not generosity that brought her. It was appetite for accurate power. Alexandra accepted the help nonetheless. When called, Alexandra spoke from the witness rail with her father's brass pen in her pocket and the restored inventory book on the clerk's table. She watched the judge compare signatures, examine pressure strokes, and hear Mr. Pell repeat his confession under fuller oath. Lady Harbury's counsel argued mismanagement, misunderstanding, emotional instability in bereavement. The argument failed against ink, marks, and witnesses. The ruling came near dusk. "On presented evidence," the judge said, "this court finds grounds for charges of fraudulent conveyance, forgery of estate instruments, and unlawful conversion of personal property. The MacDonald accounts are to be restored to lawful line. Miss Alexandra MacDonald is recognised principal beneficiary of her father's remaining estate, free of the fabricated debt schedule entered after his death." Alexandra gripped the rail once, hard, not from triumph, from the sheer strain of being seen and believed in the same hour. After court, the Duchess requested a private room. She stood with a velvet case in both hands, and no audience but Alexandra and a single clerk. "These are yours," the Duchess said. "All pieces surrendered from my possession, now released by order." Alexandra opened the case. Necklace, drops, bracelets, brooch. The garnets lay dark and steady against cream lining, familiar as a voice from childhood. The Duchess added, "I was careless with another woman's history. I am sorry." "You were deceived," Alexandra said. "I was willing to be deceived because the price pleased me." The Duchess met her eyes. "That is its own failure." Alexandra inclined her head. "Your apology is received." The week before Christmas, Harbury House was sold to satisfy legitimate creditors only. Arabella departed to an aunt in Bath. Cressida accepted a companion post with a distant relation. Neither sought Alexandra out again. Mr. Pell sent one note, in cramped hand, asking forgiveness he did not deserve quickly. Alexandra read it once, folded it, and placed it in the fire. Some debts were not payable in words. In late March, under a pale morning sky and the first thaw dripping from chapel eaves, Alexandra stood in a small stone chapel on Ashcombe Land, wearing her mother's garnets by choice, not display. The collar rested at her throat without weight this time. Her gown was ivory wool silk, plain in cut, perfect in fit, commissioned to her measurements, and paid from her own restored account. On the table, in the vestry before the ceremony, lay 2 signed documents. She had read line by line. Settlement of her MacDonald properties, in her soul legal right, and marriage articles preserving that right before and after vows. Nathaniel had signed first without amendment. When the rector asked for consent, she gave it clearly. When Nathaniel answered, his voice was low and unwavering. "I do." No ballroom watched. No one whispered rank calculations from behind a fan. The witnesses were few. The Duchess of Rexford, stern and sincere, Magistrate Ellery, invited at Nathaniel's insistence, because law should witness what law repaired, Mrs. Davies from the old kitchen, eyes bright and mouth trembling with contained joy, and the groom, now walking with only a slight stiffness, cap in hand, at the back pew. After the register was signed, Nathaniel offered Alexandra his arm. They stepped out into clean, cold light. Bells rang above them, modest and unadorned. She looked down once at the garnets against her glove and then up at him. "Stand beside me," he said quietly, echoing the command that had changed her life in a card-room at midnight. She answered with the first unguarded smile he had ever seen from her. "I already am,"